Anya and I had a chat before the webinar earlier today, just to kind of swap some ideas. And I think it's fair to say, Anya, that we were pretty much in agreement that a speaking lesson is actually about developing speaking sub-skills. It's not that we should never look at language, but that's not the primary function of that class.
Exactly.
So I guess one question we should be thinking about is, well, how do we actually operationalize that in the context of a course? You've got years of experience in lots of different areas, but what advice would you give to our participants in terms of, so I've got a frog in my throat, not great first interaction. How can we help people making a move away from a language skills focus to a speaking skills focus to actually make this happen?
I think one of the most important points is, and it's not just about teaching speaking, but about teaching in general, is always make sure that you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And this is something that you actually mentioned in your input session. You really, what students get out of an activity or of the lesson really depends on how the teacher sets it up. And so how the teacher sets it up depends on what set of aims or set of goals he or she has. And I find this so important to just keep saying, you need to go into a classroom knowing what it is that you're trying to achieve. So I think that's the most important point that I would make. Now, of course, you could go into the classroom and have into a speaking class, and you could have a completely wrong set of goals, okay? Which okay, I've got goals, but are they the right goals for this particular context? And I think one of the important takeaways from your input session is that speaking skill is not about language systems. And of course, it all goes into speaking. But speaking
and writing.
Yeah, and writing, yes, of course, yeah. But speaking, if we want to teach people speaking, we need to look at what speaking involves.
Yeah.
And of course it involves language, but this is the work on language should not be happening necessarily in a speaking class. It should be happening in a class which is devoted to working on language systems. So the speaking class should be devoted to developing those sub skills which you listed. And I think the list that you gave of what makes a good speaker, and I was actually taking notes, and you said fluency, fractional range and accuracy, interactional competence, and checking and repairing skills. And I think it's the interactional competence and checking and repairing skills that we very often forget about.
Yes.
And they are absolutely key in real life, in real communication.
And I think there is, people often criticize exam classes for teaching to the test. And I understand and I actually agree with that. But if the test itself has been designed to replicate the speaking skills that we need in quote unquote real life, then actually teaching to the test has a positive backwash on the capability, the competence, the communicative competence. You mentioned repair strategies, also therefore the strategic competence of our students. In other words, they don't just stop and come to one of those embarrassing pauses and not move on when they don't know the word for, and I put it in chat, minibus.
Yeah.
You can say, oh, I'm sorry, and involve the person you're speaking with. If it's a dialogue, it's bigger than a car, smaller than a coach that we use to go to London. I'm sorry, I forget the word, but if we've got one of those, we can travel longer.
Exactly.
And I think that's giving students, we're empowering students. I often think actually one of the very first phrases, and again, I put this into chat, I'd be interested, Anya, on your views on this, is that, at perhaps probably a A2 level or higher, one of our first speaking classes should be enabling students to express, I didn't understand you, can you say it again? And
Absolutely.
your
Absolutely.
your teaching context is quite different to mine because of geography. But how do you feel for phrases like, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that? Is that appropriate for all teaching contexts, or is it too idiomatic? And is there an alternative for those participants who are here today that we can offer as a way of being, you know, more appropriate for a multilingual English as a lingua franca context? What do you think?
I think there's sort of two issues here. The first one is how far should we go in teaching idiomatic language? And the second one is, what sort of things can you find in course books which people use all over the world? And I think actually, I'm sorry I didn't catch it, is quite a popular phrase in course books. So that's something that students will come across anyway, I think. In terms of how far you go with teaching idiomatic language, I really don't think that the language that we teach students is the language to communicate with people whose first language is English only. We actually teaching our students to communicate with people all over the world, no matter what their first language is. And that means we're actually teaching kind of international English, world English, you know, however you want to, or English as lingua franca, however you want to phrase it, however you want to call it. I think, but there's another thing that I wanted to comment on, and that was introducing those phrases which help them repair the communication as early as possible. I think this is something that kind of goes back to the complexity of communication. You know, one of my favorite definitions of communicative competence is that it's the ability to sustain meaningful communication with another human being. And it's an extremely general definition, but it has this element of communicating with another human being. And if you communicate with another human being, there's a lot of unpredictable stuff that's going to come up. Okay, and we need to prepare students for that. They need to be prepared for the fact that there is going to be things which will be happening in a context where they're communicating with somebody, where they will not necessarily understand, where they maybe will get lost. And that's something that we need to prepare them for. Another thing is, in this definition that I've just quoted, is that we're talking about meaningful communication. That's extremely important, extremely important. I mean, you know, as a teacher trainer, I have observed, I don't really know how many classes, but it definitely goes into hundreds. And I have seen teachers doing fantastic and meaningful speaking activities with students, but I have also seen teachers doing things that, or doing activities or getting students to communicate in a very artificial way, something that they would never do in real life. And another thing which I think is really important in that definition which I quoted is that the ability to sustain communication. So, and that's where the repairing skills also come in, you know, but also the interactional competence, the turn taking, the directing conversation in a given direction.
You know, initiating
exactly,
taking the turn to another point, developing the turn and changing the topic. So I guess there we're getting into the kind of the realms of spoken language as a code, which is actually quite different from the written code. And, you know, this assumption that written grammar and spoken grammar are the same thing. Now, it's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? That on the one hand, we're actually espousing speaking skills, but that we're now introducing this idea of there being a different form of spoken grammar. I mean, I remember, I think it was Mario Rinvolucri once, you know, saying, he's a great speaker that, insert name, he is. And I don't think I've ever seen any explanation or any development of that language function. It's actually very natural in any course book. So I think even if, as you say, we need to know our students incredibly well, and that perhaps helps us to be thinking about whether we depend them in a test, teach, test, but also crucially, we need to understand what kind of speaking we are preparing them to do and what do they need. Now, I think if you're teaching an ESP course, the very first thing you need to know is what are the speech conventions.
Thank you very much for saying this, Neil. This is something that I've been gearing up to mentioning myself. So thank you very much for mentioning it. That's a very good point. Very good.
Okay, so over to you then, in terms of, that's knowing your students and knowing how to get the best from them and how to avoid getting the worst from them in the class. So if we perhaps look at that one first, because I think that's really important, and then maybe we can come back to the issue of speech conventions, which relates to a question from Gabby. We've got a couple of questions coming in the Q&A as well from Saeeda and Deepak. So thank you very much indeed, Saeed, for your question. Deepak, will come back to you about certificates later, if that's okay. But perhaps if we can tease this one out together first. So how to get the best out of our students and how to avoid terrifying them, because a lot of people's teachers of speaking and teaching of English all around the world say they've got nothing to say or they're too frightened to open their mouths. How do we get the best of them in a speaking class? How do we avoid frightening them into silence?
I think one of the ways in which, one of the things that I do is I never throw students in at the deep end in that respect. Okay, test, teach, test is a different story. But in this respect, I don't actually throw students in at the deep end, because in order for students to discuss something, to say something about an issue, to debate something, they need preparation in terms of what they want to say and how they want to say it. Okay, so for me, a speaking activity actually requires quite a lot of preparation in terms of content and approach. And this is where I put students very often. First, I ask them to think about something on their own, then pair up with another student, or maybe work in a small group of 3, for example. And only then, once they've had a chance to discuss ideas and approach in a small group, it's only then that we actually go on to the full-blown speaking activity. I think, if a teacher says, well, my students don't want to open their mouths, they don't know what to say, first of all, maybe they just didn't have enough preparation time.
Can I just come in here a second? Sure. I mean, I agree absolutely that preparation time is key, but can I just share with everyone in the room today an inspirational former colleague of mine, a guy called Neil Evans at Swansea University. And like me, he loves working with visuals. But I noticed one day, I was teaching after him, and I was, picking up some papers that were on the desks. And there was this wonderful set of really interesting pictures, but also lots of key words around the edge. And he'd actually apparently gone into class before the room was empty, before the students arrived, and just put these on the desks and left them there. Now, okay, he was working with students preparing to go to university. They were motivated. But actually what instinctively they started doing was matching the vocabulary with the pictures. But it wasn't a vocabulary labeling activity. It was actually an ideas generation activity. And basically what happened was there was a massive shortcut, so that, if you've got an hour-long lesson, I don't think either of us is saying that there can't be any vocab input at the beginning.
No, of course not.
But it shouldn't be 50 minutes of a 60-minute lesson.
Yeah.
But, all the points, Saeeda has just said it in chat, preparation is of paramount importance. We're not saying don't do any language. Maybe it's not new language input, it's just language reactivation and schemata activation. But that was a really nice way to give the students something to hook their ideas onto when they got to the discussion. And the students, now this is the argument, the point we can perhaps tease out, the students didn't know that in fact that the sub-skill that they were working on was justification of ideas and evaluation of evidence. But that came out of the task organically, but they were scaffolded linguistically. They were prepared because they had the language to use to then go on. So I think, your point about, not deep ending your students and terrifying them, but also, and hopefully that was I was going to say brief, it wasn't brief at all, but just is one way of kind of preparing the students so that they've got the language to get them going, so that then you can give them help with the sub-skill that you've identified for the class, which you may or may not have told them in advance.
Yeah, precisely. I also, I think that's a wonderful idea. And it just, as you said, it goes back to the fact that students need preparation in order to actually take part in a speaking activity. I mean, even if you're speaking your first language and somebody comes up to you in the street and sticks the microphone in front of your mouth and asks you to express an opinion about something, what happens? You don't know what to say. So of course, if students are
gibberish.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if students are asked to speak about something that they haven't been prepared for, of course they're not going to have ideas, and of course they're going to be reluctant to speak. So that's one thing. Preparation is absolutely paramount.
And this comes back to a really interesting point that Dylan answered in chat about the opportunities that have been afforded by online teaching. But I think, in pre-COVID, the class was almost like a glass box. And, everything that was relevant to that class happened within the container. Whereas I think now, as we go back, thank goodness, to more and more face-to-face teaching, hopefully we take with us an understanding that, the asynchronous, synchronous blend of getting students to perhaps think about their linguistic development and the language they're going to need before the class. But perhaps also, and I don't know if you've had any experience of this or others in the room, actually getting students to record themselves on video or just audio and practice before they come in, which I think works particularly well for an aspect of speaking skills we haven't looked at so much today, giving a presentation.
Absolutely. And there's your ESB context as well, isn't there?
Absolutely.
This is, I think this is an excellent idea. And this is something that I actually do with my students sometimes. Usually I do it with business students or with managers. But it's an excellent idea for any kind of class. The advantage of doing it in this way is that students can practice whatever they want to talk about without anybody actually watching. The only person that's watching is the camera or the I don't know, smartphone, if you're recording something on the smartphone, and you can erase it. If you don't like it, you just erase it and that's it. Nobody has seen it, nobody has heard it. This is also something that some time ago I was teaching a public speaking class, and that was one of the tools that I was using. So participants would be recording themselves. And then at the end of the whole process, because obviously it was a process of preparing participants to give longer presentations, at the end of the process, they would be doing presentations in front of the whole class, and these presentations would be recorded, and then they decided whether they wanted the recording to be played in class or not. And most of the participants, because they have had this experience of recording themselves, they were actually not frightened to hear their own voice on the tape, because if you do it for the first time, it can be a bit of a weird experience,
Absolutely.
But yes, I agree, it's a fantastic idea. And yes, this is one of the things that hopefully we have taken from the online teaching environment, and something that's going to stay with us for longer. something that's not going to disappear, that there is something that students can do in preparation using the technology that we've all become much more familiar with over the past 18 months or so.
Absolutely. Is now a time, if you're happy to, Saida is very patiently, and it's a lovely question. Okay. She's asked us in Q&A, and this is a request to all of you. As you probably gathered, Anya and I are just TEFL geeks. We can keep talking for hours. Yeah. That's not why we're here today. We're here to stimulate discussion, and we would love all of you as participants to be involved in that. And, you know, in a virtual world, you can speak to us by using the chat and the Q&A. Please keep your questions coming. But Saida asks how to assess the speaking skill and what criteria does the evaluation grid contain? So can I just tease out a couple of points there before we kind of thread around together? Sure. I think, Saida, the first point is that I feel, not everyone agrees with me, that at some point, it's useful to share with our students an understanding, if they're going to do an exam, what the assessment criteria are, to understand it, and to have a kind of allow them to see where they're going. This isn't teaching to the test. It's enabling them to understand that if they get good at certain skills, which will enhance their speaking, that they will do well in the speaking test anyway. I think the other point I might raise, and Saida, I don't know if you're thinking about a particular exam here, is I don't think there is ever one evaluation grid. As if you're preparing students for a test, I think the teacher's responsibility is to know that test well, get a bit of training. I mean, if it's a Cambridge exam, there are fantastic teacher resources out there from Cambridge. IELTS is another example. But different tests will have different grids. And it's important that if we are preparing students, not just for a test, but for a particular, you've mentioned, Anya, you know, business English, you've got a student who's going to be involved in seminar skills at university in a business school, or a businesswoman giving a presentation to a board, or a group of students who want to be able to sit around the table and just discuss, you know, current affairs or their favorite music. You know, there are certain functional areas of language, as well as the repair strategies we've already talked about, that they need. So I think the answer there, we're heading, I think, Saida, to an awareness of, we assess very often, if it's a test, we have the assessment criteria provided for us. If it's not a test, it's a general English course, then I think it's for us to decide, what do our students want and need? And for us then to provide them with the skills that match their real world needs, even if they're never going to be assessed. Anya, and how can we help teachers to achieve that effectively? And Saida, please join in as well.
I think, as you said, Neil, I mean, it all depends on, first of all, what exam you're actually preparing your students for. And if it's not an exam preparation class that you are talking about, then the assessment criteria will really depend on what it is that you are aiming to achieve in that particular activity or in that particular class. So to prepare assessment criteria, you really need to go back to something that we've mentioned a few times already, and that's goals or aims that you want to achieve. And then from there, you can actually develop your assessment criteria. And this is something that I was talking about in my previous, in my session last week, when I was talking about assessment for learning, which was in fact a kind of a follow-up to Neil's session about assessment. It's difficult to come up with a universal grid that would work for everybody all of the time, in all contexts, in all classes, at all levels. I mean, obviously your aims are going to be different at, for example, A1 level versus C1 level, your goals are going to be different. Even if we're just talking about specifically the speaking skill, your goals are going to be different in a general English class versus business English class. Your goals are going to be different in or academic English or English for academic purposes. Your goals are going to be different depending on what needs students actually have. So if, for example, you're teaching a business English class and your students need to work mostly on their presentation skills, then obviously you're not going to create an assessment grid which has something to do with, I don't know, small talk. Okay, so it really depends very much on the context. And as I said, it's kind of difficult to come up with a general grid that would work all the time for everybody. So always go back to what it is that you're trying to achieve in a given class or a given activity. That's the key issue. But if it is an exam preparation class, then the exam board will have published criteria for assessment of the speaking skill. And that's the first place to look.
And I think that for me was the kind of the light bulb moment. I'd been involved in teaching first certificate probably for a couple of years. And then I stumbled across this, it was first certificate in the day, now Cambridge First and Cambridge First at School. But there was this teacher's handbook. And I opened it and there was this really, it was a bit like the inventory we saw. And that's why I put it into the presentation. But suddenly it was like, oh, I get it now. When they're doing the long term where they have the two pictures and they compare and they contrast them, there's particular language that the test is trying to kind of eke out. And oh, there's different language in the interactional part, and then there's kind of more turn taking required in the final part, but also part 3 as well. And suddenly it was like, different types of speaking require different functions, but I don't need to go away and analyze this because someone's done it for me. So I think if you're preparing people for a test, the first thing to do is find out, is there similar support for the exam that you're teaching? And if not, after all, the Cambridge exams, they're global, pretty much cover most of the types of exam interaction for language that we see around the world. So, you know, use them as an example, and it kind of trains you into getting your mind into the mind of the item writer. So now, you know, I look at a particular speaking task and okay, I know what language that's actually trying to get out. Therefore, I know what language I need to help the students to learn.
Can I just come in here with one point which is related to the to what you can find in the exam handbook for teachers. One of the points that I made in the chat during our discussion when we were watching the input session, I said that one of the things that I like doing and that I do quite a lot is I actually talk to my students to help them identify what sort of speaking subskill is being tested in a given part of an exam, in a given task, because that really helps them to understand why they're doing it in the exam. That helps them in terms of preparation. So that means that they're going to be better prepared for the exam itself. But it also means that they will be more conscious of the sub-skills that they need to use, not just in the exam, but in life generally, when they're speaking English.
That last point is the key one. Most of the speaking classes, I'm actually teaching a speaking class tomorrow. Most of my speaking at the moment is linked to the development of clinical communication skills for doctors and nurses wanting to work internationally, and particularly here in the UK. So on the one hand, you know, I've got a nice list of clinical communication skills that the exam assessment grid provides me with. But key to this, and I think it's also key to motivation, which was a point that was raised earlier, is that, yes, you know, I involve the students, as you're suggesting, in that discussion around, well, you know, what do you think you need to do this? What language would you expect here? But also, and when do you use that in the real world? That's the key link. And I think as soon as a student says, oh, language, so one of them, for example, is establishing rapport. So, it's like, okay, so you're meeting a patient for the first time. What language would you use for a patient you've met before? What language would you use for a patient you've never met before? How did it differ? Crucially, it's not just the question, but that's what answer do you anticipate, so you can deal with that. And then, right, now think about a time when you spoke to a patient like that yourself recently. How did you do? How do you want to improve it? So it's those making those connections out of the classroom into the real world that I think helps our learners to go, okay, that's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm important. That's why I need to actually focus on this.
Yeah. I think that was a really good point. I think since you mentioned motivation, I think I'd like to go back to the point which came up a bit earlier when we were talking about how can we ensure that students how can we ensure students' involvement, and how can we ensure that we teach students the right way when we talk about the speaking class? And one of the things that I forgot to mention earlier was that obviously you need to ensure that students are prepared for a speaking activity. But another thing is also you need to know what sort of feedback you want to give students after the speaking activity, and whether you actually want to intervene during the speaking activity or not, and if you intervene, when and why. And this is something that, again, I would actually discuss with my students as well. So if for whatever reason I want to intervene, I want to be able to intervene during a speaking activity, this is what I'm going to tell my students. There are a number of different occasions where I might intervene, and I would do it for this and this reason. Or during the activity, I'm actually just going to listen to what you're saying. I'm going to take notes. Don't worry about this. It's not that I'm taking note of, the mistakes that you're making. But we're going to talk about what I have written down after you finish speaking. So I think this idea of how the teacher monitors and how you then provide feedback to the students is also something that encourages students to open up and to speak freely.
I saw a lovely tip that I picked up years ago now, is that if you're in a physical classroom, take in with you a whole load of post-it notes, or better still, take in with you a whole load of recycled paper and cut them up into squares. And as the class is discussing, and particularly this, I think this works well with whole class discussions and debates, you can be feeding very, very quietly, without saying a word, a little post-it note to someone. So if you've got a student who is dominating, you say, I'd like you to ask someone a question. If you've got a student who hasn't dared to speak yet, then you can say, I want you to use this phrase to interrupt in the next 3-4 minutes. And of course, the alternative of that in the online environment is chat and private messages, where you can be sending people, messages. Now, I know, that means that some people just don't read chat during classes. So as a teacher, we've got to say, sometimes I'll be sending you feedback. It may well be to say, well done for something that was fantastic, or it might be a little instruction for you so that they know to attend to that.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really nice way of, managing the feedback and the interaction patterns in real time without interrupting the flow of saying, right, okay, sorry, Anya, you're not saying anything. You need to speak. Horror of this.
Yeah. I think. Sorry, can I just add one little practical tip here as well? One of the things that I learned very early on in my teaching career, which was hundreds of years ago, was that when I monitor students per work, group work, and it doesn't matter whether it's a speaking activity or any other type of activity that students are doing in small groups, it's a good idea not to tower over students, because they just feel threatened. your physical presence can be a bit too much for them. So one of the things that you need to learn to do is kind of sit or stand somewhere at a distance from your students and kind of tune in to different pairs or groups.
Or if you've got a horseshoe, walk behind
exactly,
and kneel down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If I may, because I don't think you and I anticipated this at all, but it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, it gives the opportunity. Alenka, I'm not sure if you're still with us. And Alenka, feel free to put this into chat or also just to come on to speak.
I think so.
You are here, Alenka. Now, you are making the point about getting students to interact using Alexa. And this opens the whole idea of AI and how that's going to potentially change the way that we can help our students with speaking. So, enough of me. Alenka, can you just share with us, if you don't mind, how would that work and how are you working with it right now? Maybe put some ideas into chat. Whilst that's happening, Anya, AI, using Alexa, any thoughts?
I was recently giving a presentation on the future of education, and obviously technology featured prominently in my talk. And one of the things that that I was talking about was how we use technology, and also the fact that there is a lot of fear around that that teachers are going to be replaced by machines. And there's actually research which shows that the probability of teachers being replaced by computers is around 1%. And that really goes back to, or one of the reasons for this is that human dimension of communication. I think that technology is extremely important, and the last 18 months or so have actually shown how important technology is. And I believe that the likelihood of teachers being replaced by computers is really, really low. But if we don't actually make friends with technology, if we don't keep working on using technology within the context of the teaching that we do, we will not be replaced by machines, but we will be replaced by those teachers who have actually made friends with technology, who have come up with ways in which they can use technology to students' advantage. I think AI, I mean, obviously it's still early days, although technology develops really, really fast. So I'm not sure what we're going to be saying about AI and the use of AI in teaching English next year. But I think, we are at the moment, we are still at a stage where machines or artificial intelligence cannot recognize certain things which are human attributes. And this is something where the teacher is simply irreplaceable. So as I said, yes, we will use technology, we will continue using technology, and we will continue developing ways in which we can use technology to the students' advantage. But is that going to change the principles that we work by? Is that going to change the methodology? I don't think it's going to change, or is it going to change the intellectual processes which are used in teaching and learning process? I'm not sure. I think it's not going to change that. It's going to help us in ways which maybe we still cannot predict. But I don't see AI taking a lead role in teaching, or teaching English more specifically, in the near future. And there is a comment from Olenka,
the comment from Olenka, I give some tips to students. They love using apps, absolutely. I encourage students to improve their pronunciation, asking questions using Google Talk, Alexa. Technology helps us, never replaces us, very much what you were saying. But yes, that's really interesting, Alenka, isn't it? Because of course, I believe that there is a setting within Alexa that you can actually choose the language that she responds in. So even if you are in, well, any country in the world, or most countries in the world, there are probably somewhere where there are sanctions, that if you set your Alexa to be an English-speaking Alexa, then you can actually interact with Alexa. So I could set my Alexa, sorry, I've got Alexa going off in the background, but I mean, potentially I could say, Alexa, che ora parte il prossimo treno per Londra? And she's probably going to reply now and say, I do not understand, rather than Alexa, what time does the next London train leave? So yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting one in terms of, you know, a non-interactional, but a kind of a practice. Alexa's talking to me in another room now. Shut up, Alexa. I'm not so sure that I entirely agree with you about AI. Mm-hmm. I know that Cambridge is working a lot right now with a bot for the marking of the writing exam for BULATs. And I know that there was discussion about whether speaking would follow. And I think, you know, it's a brave new world out there. I've always believed passionately that teachers will never be replaced by machines. I just wonder whether assessment by AI might happen. Who knows?
I think it will. No, that I think will. I think, as you said, Cambridge is working on it. Pearson has actually got a test where speaking and writing are assessed by the machine, if you like. Right. And they've actually conducted some research to check whether there's any discrepancy between human markers and machine markers, and there doesn't seem to be a significant difference. So this is something that I believe will happen. Whether that's a good development or not a good development, I'm not sure. I think it really depends on the type of task, you know. Although again, you know, it keeps changing so fast that, as I said earlier, I don't know what we're going to be talking about in a year's time. You know, maybe in a year's time, I'm going to say, yeah, it's here, it's arrived, you know, let's deal with it.
But as we come towards the end of this presentation, Alenka, and thank you for telling us you're in Peru, it strikes me a really interesting way of thinking about this, to wrap it all up, is to encourage all of you to go back into your virtual or your real staff rooms and say, this will probably work best with higher level learners. What speaking activity could we design with a group of high level B1 plus and a higher that's about the use of AI as in the future? So, you know, could we replace the teacher with an artificial teacher? Could we replace, how would you feel about your head teacher being a robot? And then think about what speaking skills, sub-skills are necessary for those students to have that discussion or debate or whatever convention you're working with, whatever genre you're working with successfully. And then have a play at setting the task up. So, you know, the topic is AI replacing or not XYZ. What are the speaking sub-skills that learners need to do this successfully? How might you assess this? And how could you get the learners to assess each other?
Excellent idea. I'm all for it.
Yeah, that's Luke's input at its best.
Absolutely.